I think Nouns is extremely inspirational for many reasons, but two stand out in my mind. Is one, the getting rid of the Discord is saying, hey, like, an actual society doesn't have like a single way of like there needs to be multimedia. How about that in terms of like the way that people engage? And in doing so, is actually espousing a decentralized approach to building something versus a centralized approach. And so that I think is really impactful. I don't think any other like on-chain group has taken that approach. I think that has also been an inspiration for us in terms of like how we want to build Farcaster. But I think the other thing is I think that the fork shows that the team is willing to commit to the actual vision and willing to pay a huge price to that in terms of like, you have a bunch of people leave, like have to take this hard-earned ETH for the treasury and let it go. But in doing so, I think of it as almost like a forest fire where it's like, you actually kind of it's this pretty traumatic thing that happens, but from that you get a lot of new growth and new life. And so I think actually being willing to kind of have nothing be too enshrined or too ossified as a way of doing things, that shows a dynamic community. And the fact that it's kind of being done, not kind of, it is being done in a decentralized way. I think very few people have been able to accomplish that. Because be both decentralized and moving forward with decisions that have consequences, I think is actually quite admirable. And I think a lot of decentralized teams within the broader on-chain ecosystem would learn a lot from paying attention to what's happening with Nouns.
Welcome back to Zero Rights Reserved, the podcast about nouns, DAOs, Ethereum, NFTs, and more, brought to you by the Noun Square Media Collective. I'm your host, Toady Hawk, and this week our co-host is Prof. Witter, aka the Nounish Professor. Our guest today is the esteemed Dan Romero, aka DWR. He's a Nouner, a trailblazer, and founder of Farcaster Protocol. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks for having me.
Hey,
Thanks
Dan.
so much for coming. Nouns are people, places, and things. So we always like to start on this podcast with the people. Love to hear a little bit about your story, about your journey. I know that like many founders and builders in this space, you are a Coinbase alum, I believe. So maybe you can start there and just sort of give us the Dan Romero story.
Yeah, so originally from the East Coast, and I moved to San Francisco in 2013, was working at a SaaS company, had dismissed Bitcoin as a kind of a Ponzi scheme. Fred Ursum is actually a college friend, and he had originally pitched me on joining Coinbase when I moved to San Francisco. And classic, didn't read the book or, just judged it by the cover. And later that year, I actually read the Bitcoin white paper for the first time and became kind of obsessed with Bitcoin and kind of the future of building new types of applications that use blockchains, right? It's like a new type of computer. Ended up joining Coinbase, worked on a bunch of different things at Coinbase, and then kind of fell in love with crypto again when Ethereum started to kind of really kick off in 2016, 2017. And I think the thing that I've always been excited about Ethereum, and look, I still really like Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is amazing, and it's the first, and it's not going away anytime soon. But I think where I naturally started to drift towards Ethereum is people could use it to build actual applications. I think Bitcoin has ossified in a way that's probably good for Bitcoin, but not necessarily the thing that I'm most excited about when I think about like what gets me excited about cryptocurrency and permissionless public blockchains. It's about building apps and experiences, many of which probably don't have like an explicit financial component. And so I think Ethereum felt like this idea of a global computer and kind of moving in that direction. And so when I left Coinbase in 2019, I took some time off and as part of kind of that exploration, started kicking around an idea that I'd been interested in probably since 2009, 2010 of how could you actually move Twitter, which is kind of a centralized company, to a protocol. And I think there's a great Paul Graham essay. If you just Google, Paul Graham, Twitter essay, there's a very simple, short essay he has on his website that he wrote in 2009 about Twitter and how it's this kind of weird quirk of history that Twitter, which should kind of be a protocol, short text-based updates in a broadcast format, somehow ended up within a company. And the other kind of idea that I've always been interested in, and we can get into it a little bit more, is RSS, which I still use today, is this very simple, decentralized, permissionless protocol that kind of got outcompeted by Web 2 social networks.
That's how many of you are listening right now, is on RSS.
Right, exactly. All the podcasts today are effectively distributed by RSS. But how could you take something as simple as that and start to add functionality to it in a way that you could actually start to have that experience be competitive with Twitter? And so Varun, my co-founder, and I started kind of working on this idea of RSS Plus, which 3 years later, and we're actually roughly at about 3 years of having started working on Farcaster, we have Farcaster, which is now a permissionless, decentralized social network. And yeah, happy to talk about any of those things.
No, I love that. I love that you leapfrog right into our next question, which was what made you want to tackle the problem of sufficiently decentralized social. You talked about it a little bit just now, but is there a specific reason why that problem, that pain point, was attractive to you to try to tackle?
Yeah, so I actually was an early Twitter API developer in college. I built a website with a couple of friends called Strawpoll, which prior to Twitter having native polls,
I remember that.
Yeah, you could reply to this account, and via the Twitter API, we were able to kind of tally. It's actually how polls kind of almost work on Farcaster today. There's a bot called Surveycaster, which effectively does the same thing. And the Twitter founders used it. We were actually like very, very early days API, so we were actually one of the larger consumers of the API at that point, just because we were getting a bunch of replies. And I just thought it was the coolest thing in the world that you had this kind of social network that had these really permissive open APIs. And I think that era of Twitter, people forget there was no official Twitter mobile client. It was a website, and there were a bunch of independent third-party mobile clients, Tweety, Tweetbot, Twitterific, some of the best indie developers.
RIP all of these.
Yeah, exactly. Some of the best indie developers in the early mobile app ecosystem. Ton of UI innovation. So pull to refresh. Actually, Twitter has the patent to pull to refresh. They don't.
No way.
It. Yeah, but that was a result of the Tweety acquisition. Lauren Brichter, who's kind of an epically amazing iOS developer, built that into the Tweety in terms of just pulling down. We take it for granted today. You pull down to refresh the feed. But yeah, that's the era I grew up with in terms of I'm like very much from the Web 2.0 version of Web 2. And so remixes, APIs, and watching that change over the last decade where social media went from, or social networking is what they used to call it, went to social media, and kind of outsized influence, a lot of centralization, kind of curtailing the open access via APIs, all for reasonable reasons, I think, for those companies, but in terms of at the kind of detriment to, I think, consumers and consumer choice. And so I think that is like the underlying motivation for me is I believe a world where if you can somehow get a decentralized social network to some amount of scale, and I think that's a really, really hard thing, and we have not figured that out yet. That's what we're focused on. If you can actually do that, then the amount of permissionless innovation that's going to occur on top of that network is going to be substantial and massive amount of benefit to people, right? Because now any developer with an interesting idea doesn't have to go bootstrap a new social network to try that idea. They can just tack it on to an existing social network, and it's much lower friction for someone to go try it out. And if that idea works, now you have hopefully just yet another way to connect humans. And I think generally connecting people around the world together is a net positive for humanity on a wide variety of kind of axes.
You touched on something in that sentence just now that I was actually going to ask you about. You casted recently, social networks are better than social media. What did you mean by that cast? I think you tweeted it as well.
Well, if you go back to those early days of like Web 2.0, early days of Facebook, early days of Twitter, it was social networking, right? Social was the category, but people would talk about social networks, and I think networks are. It feels futuristic and it feels people centric, right? In the sense that like we're connecting. media has the connotation that it's kind of broadcast, centralized. The big accounts are the only ones that matter. You don't have as much choice. The algorithm dominates. Like, I think if you were just to ask the average person, social network, social media, which one has a more positive connotation to you? Like, I think most people would actually probably choose social network.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I don't know if you saw this tweet from 4156 recently, but during the fork and everything that was happening and all the discussion around book value versus meme value, he made a tweet talking about how he was going to stop using the word meme value and start using the word network value to describe, the intrinsic value of owning a noun or being a part of this community is literally, a social network built on an NFT base.
Yeah, and I actually think that's one of the big bets for us over the next year is and to jump in, Farcaster kind of is this decentralized, pretty low level protocol, but Warpcast is the app that we've been building, and one of the big initiatives we're making a bet on is this concept of channels, and it's been, I think, quite successful with Nouns. And it's the idea that you should be able to actually bring your existing network and plug it into the infrastructure that exists with Farcaster and the apps there. But importantly, you as the kind of, or you is maybe not the right term, a collective group of people as a network or community actually retains kind of ownership of that user list and that ability to kind of fork it out and say, hey, look, this isn't working for us anymore. We're going to move to a different tool. Or even better, there is no canonical tool, which I think Nouns is very much ahead on the kind of thinking here. So rather than having a canonical Discord, you just say, hey, this is the canonical list of people who are participating in this network. And now we are going to offer a variety of tools that are permissionlessly built on top of an on-chain primitive. And so actually, I'm very bullish on this idea that the kind of like on-chain groups, DAOs, I think have a lot of baggage. So you just simplify it. A kind of group of people defined by something on chain, being able to kind of plug into different interfaces, different networks. I think that is really powerful. And I think Balaji, of course, always a little ahead here as well. This concept of a network state, I think he gets a lot of flack just because he's Balaji, so people have maybe a very strong opinion of him one way or another. But I think it seems to be like a foreign concept in a world of nation states where people think of like, okay, I am American or I am, whatever X country citizen based on physical location. But if you think about the amount of time you spend as like kind of a very digitally native, both of you and myself included, like we are digital natives, and we spend a lot of time interacting with people all over the world based on kind of shared interests, right? And so I think it's wild that most of the people on Farcaster I've never met in person, nor did I know prior to working on Farcaster, right? If you just look at the top 100 most active users, kind of like in terms of just like engagement on the network, I think I probably knew 10 of those people before. And I think that's an amazing thing that we've kind of just constructed this cloud-based community. I think the Nouns is the same thing. And in some cases, Nouns, again, being ahead is, I think, a little bit more pseudonymous and a little bit more, hey, you know what? I'm even going to take away the baggage of the kind of who I am as a person in the real world with all of the kind of baggage that comes with that. And just say, hey, this is my identity online. I have this little pixel avatar to represent that. And I want to be taken face value on how I interact in this digital space rather than whatever preconceived set of notions you have about me as a person in the real world.
I was looking at the questions today and I said, I got one to add: network states. Like, I'm sure there'll be a moment where this will come out. And I love this whole concept. I love, Balaji's concept of network state because it makes a lot of sense for all the reasons you just said. And to me, Farcaster is already, and this is my question to you, to me, it feels like if it's not a network state, it's on its way. What are your thoughts on that in terms of where does Farcaster fit in the idea of a network state? And also, I'd love to hear, I know you're going to be speaking at the Network State Conference, if you want to give us a little alpha on that and what's coming.
Yeah, so fun fact, I already did the network state talk probably a couple of weeks ago
What?
Balaji originally asked me to go, and I said, I'm not traveling for a conference, sorry. And he goes, great, well, let's do a Zoom call anytime you want to do it. And I said, well, the only time I'm willing to do it is on a Friday evening when my kids are asleep. He said, great, well, let's do it. So amazing sales ability there in terms of just getting me to talk about it. And it was great because I actually think, to your point, there is a lot of overlap between Balaji's, I think, kind of concept of network states and then a manifestation of a cloud-based community that is Farcaster. I think the challenge with network state as a term is it's just very charged, right? And I think that's useful in terms of kind of creating an intellectual spark and generating conversation. But I think it also creates a defensiveness for people who, again, identify when you think of nation or state or citizen, you probably think of the physical country that you were born in or raised or kind of assimilated into in the case of
Yeah,
the US.
you talked about DAOs having baggage. So if DAOs have baggage, then nations definitely have baggage.
Right.
Yeah, just a little bit.
so I think like anything, I think it takes time. It takes other people kind of positioning it to say, hey, maybe this idea is a little bit more extreme, but that's useful for creating the conversation. Here's a basic manifestation of it, right? Like I think there are plenty of people who use Farcaster daily that don't think of it as a nation state. But if you were to say, hey, is this a community of people, regardless of whether you've met them or not, that you have an affinity towards and you're willing to kind of do kindness, unconditional, like, do something where you're not expecting something back because of norms or because of a kind of emergent culture. I think we have plenty of examples of that. I think that there was actually an example specifically network state oriented where someone offered their ticket to the network state conference to someone else on the network. And I think Grin recasted that and says the kindness on Farcaster is so heartwarming. And I think, again, these are internet strangers, right? Like we've been told and programmed that internet strangers are only trolls or people who are just nasty to each other because they can kind of hide behind the screen. But here's a counterexample. And does that scale? I hope. I think we're going to try our best. And I think there's a lot you can do in product to help kind of nudge that. But I do think the idea that you can actually create emergent culture, and Nouns, again, a great example of this, in a strictly digital way, in a way that people don't necessarily know each other in person. And again, in the case of Nouns, you're kind of doing it even more on hard mode where you're doing a lot pseudonymously, which another Balaji concept of this idea of the pseudonymous economy. So I think the network state meme will continue to proliferate and exist, but I think my like critique of it is it needs better retail packaging. And this is the same concept that Balaji has around the Gray Tribe. It's the idea is, I think, rooted in something that there's definitely truth behind it, and there's actually appeal if positioned right. And so, if you think of like Don Draper and Mad Men, it's like you kind of really need that marketing or kind of retail oriented, consumer oriented person to really say, how can we package this in a way that doesn't seem so scary for someone whose identity might be wrapped up in the previous paradigm.
And that's, to the point that you made it kind of in there, there's a different type of culture that's being developed on Farcaster. And there's a different type of person who's like really attracted to being super active there. And I think that's what's creating this little mini network state or whatever you want to call it, or on-chain community that's just a little different. Like, what have you seen in terms of themes to the folks that sort of really get active, really dive into Farcaster that's different from other platforms?
Well, I've brought this up on a bunch of different interviews, podcasts before, and on Farcaster, but I do think Eugene Wei's essay Status as a Service is entirely accurate. And this took me a while because I think the initial go-to-market for Farcaster was invite Dan's network of people that from his time at Coinbase and then Silicon Valley, and most of those people churned. And I think where people who have stuck around on Farcaster, a lot of those initial groups of people were people who were kind of like one or two referrals away from the original group of people. So I onboarded a bunch of people in my network and asked everyone for one or two referrals and kind of worked my way through that list of people. And going back to Eugene's essay, I think the people who stuck around were people who didn't necessarily have a lot of pre-existing status on Twitter. Very, very few instances of people, I always say it's like they talk decentralized, but they act centralized in the sense that they're very happy to continue using Twitter despite wanting to complain about it because they've already built up an audience. And I can't fault them for that, right? Like it takes a long time to build an audience, and that's a valuable asset for individuals because it gives you an opportunity to spread your message.
I think that's part of the promise of crypto in a way too, though, is disenfranchised people have an opportunity to, bring themselves up that they maybe wouldn't otherwise have an opportunity if crypto weren't there. So in this case, subbing maybe money for status, but a similar idea.
Yeah, totally. And I think so. It's just this idea that you can go settle this new social network, and by being early and active and thoughtful there, you're naturally, if the social network grows, and so that's kind of the view, the social contract that we have from Warpcaster, the core team, is like, we're going to grow the network. And so if you continue to participate, you benefit from that in terms of you're building an audience. And if we build that network in the right way, your audience is thoughtful and interesting. And so that's actually useful for you, whether you're, an entrepreneur or a writer or an artist or anyone kind of wanting to put a message out into the world or a product. And now you have a group of people that are going to see it, right? Whereas on Twitter, it's kind of like screaming into the void.
So the airdrop is literally the friends we made along the way then.
Well, this is my big push on, everyone
That's it,
talks
Tony.
about.
That's all you're getting. It's more friends.
This is interesting. It's like, well, you need to have some type of token or airdrop or whatever economic compensation. And my push is, if you have a thoughtful and interesting audience that is growing, that is a form of economic compensation. And arguably, it's a much more flexible form of compensation because it's not limited to just like one thing, right? And you can actually now, let's say you're kind of like a software entrepreneur, and then you go pivot to making art. Like you can use that same audience to kind of say, hey, this is what I'm doing now, and like that is actually pretty powerful. And I think the other underrated thing, which fine, like it just, once you get to scale, it will matter, is you actually do have a direct relationship with your audience, right? Whereas on Twitter or YouTube, you're one terms of service violation from whoever is running the platform, whether it was the previous regime or the current regime. They don't like you, boom. The challenge with that is, if you've gone through that, you acutely understand the pain, and then the value of actually when you're building an audience on something where you control that relationship, or that relationship isn't intermediated by a third party, you value it. But it's a little bit of like, you don't value that kind of stuff until you run through it for most people, because otherwise they're pretty happy on social, centralized social media. I was just going to say, the one person I always want to give a shout out to, and shows how committed ideologically he is to like these principles, is Vitalik. I mean, he is using Farcaster, and the guy has 5 million followers on Twitter, right?
Yep.
Granted, I'm sure whenever he tweets, it's pretty intolerable in terms of the number of bots that are replying, but I think very few people above 100,000 followers on Twitter have stuck around in any meaningful way on Farcaster. And I think Vitalik is a good example of someone who practices what he preaches. Whereas
I think his Twitter hack helped too. When he got hacked on Twitter, that helped him go, all right, sure, now I'm definitely just going to use Farcaster, which was great.
Yeah, but I would just say it's, I now am acutely aware of the people who actually talk decentralized and then act decentralized. I think that there are a lot of people out there who actually, and I can't fault them for it. They basically are just trying to use crypto to kind of get ahead in terms of whether it's an audience size or the next stage in their career, which is fine. But you quickly figure out who the true believers are in terms of the people who are willing to kind of like talk and act the same way.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. Well, a good example of that is we put all of these podcasts on chain, and we wish that could be our primary method of distribution, and maybe one day it will be. But to your point, even in an on-chain community like Nouns, which is firmly entrenched in like this Web3 world, it's still hard to get people to download your podcast as a NFT instead of on an RSS feed. It's just it's tough. But at least if we're making inroads and pushing people in that direction and giving them the option, it starts the conversation.
Yeah, look, I mean, there are so many things I wish we could go add to Warpcast. I think it's just we're in this ruthless prioritization mode of like the only thing that matters is significantly growing quality daily active users for the protocol. Everything else is secondary. But I would
Yeah.
love to be in a situation where if you're natively publishing a podcast on chain, that can just flow directly into
Love that.
Warpcast for people who care about
Yes,
it, and
please.
to start having a way of because I think most of the podcast players, and again, I always want to be like intellectually honest. I think most podcast players just look at it and be like, the market is focused on RSS and traditional podcasts.
Of
The
course.
Web3 stuff or the crypto stuff is too niche.
Yeah.
And I think
And they're right.
yeah, and so it's
Not
completely
wrong.
rational, right? So like I think there are a lot of people who get like upset about that, and I think you just have to approach it. It's like, what are the incentives? And show me the incentives, show me the outcome, right? And so I think that there has to be sometimes you just have people who are willing to do something for an ideological reason and put a lot of care into making the great product experience, and in that way you actually start to induce demand, which can create its own flywheel. But yeah, I mean, I have that actually. I think is I have 50 ideas or so I put on my blog that I probably should just update that list in terms of things that you could go build on Farcaster. But I think a really simple client would just be something that looks for people on the Farcaster graph, and then maybe they can point to their on-chain, podcast or something, and then it would just be a podcast player. And you could kick out to the other podcast players, right? Like you could
Yeah.
do it really, really lightweight. But the whole point is it's kind of offering a
Discovery.
kind of like view into the world of, hey, I want to look at the graph not based on CAS, but just actually what's the on-chain media people are putting out, right? So you could do the same thing for music NFTs or something like that. And so
their interface is actually doing that, but it's doing it along with other things, but it is built on Farcaster, and it's pulling from that feed. So with GM Farcaster, we're doing something similar to what Toadie's doing, and we're streaming it on Unlonely because we're trying to keep it Farcaster native, if you will. And then we are recording it and then putting it on Zora as NFTs and using that as sort of where our recording lives. And what we found out is that Interface, which is another client, Farcaster client that does a whole bunch of other stuff, but it has a built-in video player. So if you're, the ZEROPOD GM Farcaster will come up and it'll play automatically the whole
Nice.
thing. So it's out there. It just isn't quite in the form that we want it yet, but it can be done. So there we go. So shout out Interface.
yeah, I think Interface is an amazing product. And then the founder is on Farcaster. I think one challenge sometimes though with these tools is, so Interface is a great example. It does so much, and I actually think when you do a lot, it's sometimes harder for people to figure out like what is the actual one thing that this thing does well. And to be fair, that's the same criticism I would give to Warpcast, in that I think I look at some of the features and I kind of like, you treat every feature almost like a child, and you're like, oh, I don't want to get rid of that. We had to spend time working on that. 10% of people like it, they love it, and 90% of people don't care. And so I think, but there is value in focus and value in what is the one thing that this is just excellent at versus there are 30 things that this is like pretty good at. And I actually shouldn't say that Interface isn't good at that. I actually think the thing Interface is excellent at is you follow someone on chain, you get push notifications anytime they do something on chain. I think they're really great at that. But I think that there is value in apps that are opinionated and really focused. And I think where the challenge, and I talked about this recently with Bill Z on the Abora space that we did. We do every couple of weeks, kind of like almost like a Noun Square, but like for Farcaster, because he has this client.
Nice.
But I think the challenge is a lot of the people wanting to build a client are looking to do a venture-backed startup, right? And I can't fault them for that. I'm doing one myself. I worked on one prior to Coinbase. There's a lot of upside if it works out. So totally reasonable thing for people to do. But I think where Farcaster is at this stage is just too small to support meaningful growth for a venture-backed client outside of Warpcast, which obviously we're also building the protocol. We're heavily driving the protocol forward. And so I think the thing that I'm coming around to is that there may be a period, and it may be 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, where the best candidates for like apps that really plug into the kind of usefulness of Farcaster are hobbyist apps or kind of like those early Twitter apps where it's like one person, they're kind of doing it, maybe moonlighting at night. Like Flink is a good example of this, which now, by the way, is the majority of signups coming into Farcaster post permissionless. Sloke has a day job, and that's just
That's crazy.
comes home, eats dinner, and then does 3 hours of coding and kind of labor of love. And easy for me to say in the sense that, you know, we have a bunch of money raised, like I can think about this full time. But what I would say is, like, I think a lot of great products in software come as a result of people just being passionate about it versus approaching it straight up as saying, how do I turn this into a company? And so I think that is something that we're thinking about. And you know, Greg Squirreloff is another great example of this, in that he's not working on Farcaster full time. He's working for ENS, but he has like 4 or 5 tools that are really useful, right? He just made this one recently where you can gift a Farcaster account. And so I think that's probably where
that's
we're
awesome.
going to be. And so going back to this idea of the podcast app, I think of that as like, you probably just, if you're really into podcasts and you want to learn React Native or Swift, just building the podcast player that you kind of wish existed and maybe making it a little bit more on-chain oriented, that in of itself is probably the right way for that thing to get started versus saying, oh, I want to go build a venture-backed company from the get-go. You're just not going to have enough growth for that type of app.
But if
be the podcast app.
Yeah, if you build such a thing, Tony and I will be very, very happy.
We're just talking a little bit about the permissionlessness of Farcaster, and so by the time this pod comes out, it'll have been a few weeks now since there was a major milestone for Farcaster in that you went completely permissionless. For someone from the outside looking in, what does that mean, and why is it important?
Yeah, so we had a sign-up gate for the first 3 years of Farcaster, right? It took us probably 6 months to get a prototype, like what we would call like V1. And then we kept the sign-up gate, which was me. Like you had to DM me or know me to get an invite into the network.
That's how I got it.
DM for a while. You had to DM a secret word of the day.
Right.
It was like
and
Pee-wee's Playhouse. It was fantastic.
So that's inspired by a couple things. So one, I think social networks, you need to develop norms in a culture. And if you just open things up, especially in crypto, and if people think that it's like, oh, like there's potential for an airdrop, I'm just going to go, like you quickly race to the bottom, feels bots, feels like kind of like there's no, I use this term, it's from Arabic. So if I'm misusing it, I would love someone to correct me, but asabiya, you can look it up. It's just this connectedness of society. And so the idea that you kind of like want to actually slowly build up the network and find the people who are active and develop the culture, I think is really important. And I actually think in some ways that's inspired by just seeing Coinbase grow and realizing that, you know, when we were going through hypergrowth in 2017 and 2018, at any given point, 30% of the company had been at the company for fewer than 3 months. And so you're in this kind of weird situation where most people don't know the culture. And so what ends up happening is when you have people who are both new starting to interact, they're importing culture from the previous company. So you have a Google person and a Facebook person working on a team together, and there's no OG Coinbaser. The company values are actually going to start drifting because there's no one to kind of actually teach how things work. Same thing with a social network. And so I think our point of view was, hey, we need to go get the technical stuff correct on the protocol side of things, which ended up taking us about 3 years. There's no rush to kind of turn on the floodgates because all you're going to get is kind of drift from a cultural standpoint while you're also focused on trying to get the technical stuff right. So I think our approach has been, hey, like, let's let this bake a little bit slower and just constantly be adding new people just so you have the plumbing of onboarding working. Fresh faces are always nice, increases the number of people on the network who are active, get more followers. And it took us, 3 years, and we did about 20,000 people prior to permissionless. But now the network, we turned off the sign-up gate. So the network is entirely permissionless. And what I mean by that is you can sign up. You don't need to use Warpcaster to do that. You can do that at the smart contract level if you're technically sophisticated. You can go use another client like Flink. All of the data and APIs for the network live in this piece of software we built called hubs. So you can kind of think of it as like an Ethereum node, but specific for the Farcaster network. That's available on GitHub. You can download it, get it running, and in 30 minutes, you'll have an entire copy, similar to an Ethereum node. You'd have an entire copy of the Farcaster network and full access to the data and APIs. So you can kind of create new casts, you can follow people, etc. And you can be doing that entirely on your own machine. You can do it on a Raspberry Pi at this point, or you can do it in the cloud. And then the last part is you don't need to use like an official client. Like you have to use the Twitter client in order to use Twitter. Twitter's always had a little bit more permissive. So
even more so post Elon. Like you can't even use TweetDeck or any of the other ones that you used to be able to use.
But to use a more aggressive, Instagram. There has never been a third-party Instagram client. Instagram shuts that down as fast as possible, and it just like that. That's their prerogative. They've built the network, they've built the value, so they can go do it. But I think what's pretty neat is, Warpcast. We've built the network. We spent 3 years doing this. We have our own client. You can participate in the network and never have to touch a single API or terms of service that we run. Like you can just use the network completely permissionlessly. And so I think this is credible neutrality as a concept that Vitalik has talked about in the past. And I think that that's pretty inspirational for both, Varun and myself, in that we want to hold ourselves to a bar where the network that we've built actually delivers on the promise of permissionlessness, which enables both innovation, but also you as either a user or developer own the relationship, whether it's with your audience or your user base, and there's no third party that can come in and cut that relationship.
At the same time, I know you have a focus on permissionlessness that we've just talked about, but you've also been vocal and maybe opinionated about setting norms on Farcaster and specifically on Warpcaster. Recently, you made a post about norms with regards to short cast responses, and there was some good discussion on that. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about why you think norms are important despite the permissionless ethos of Farcaster.
Yeah, so there's the technical protocol, right? So it's like, can I technically do everything? And then there's the kind of like practical, like how do people participate in the kind of instantiation of the network, right? Because you can think about it, you can fork all the code is open source, so you can fork the contracts, you could fork the hubs, spin up your own version of it, and if you can convince a bunch of other people to show up to that network, great. Like that it's a completely new network. So I fully expect someone to do that at some point. In the same way that I think the EVM has been adopted by a bunch of other blockchains or kind of solutions. I think the thing about what's made Farcaster as a social network, so move the protocol and more about what's a social network, it's actually the people using it, successful thus far is the level of thoughtfulness people bring when they are there. There's a level of kindness and civility. Vitalik has actually accused the network of being too polite, which I'll take that as a compliment. But I think
for a Canadian too, that's crazy.
Yeah, those Canadians.
But I think part of it is we put a lot of effort into slow build. People, when you move things slowly, people understand the way things work in that culture, and if they don't like it, they just stop using it. And so we have 3 years of culture, or maybe call it two years of substantial Farcaster culture that's been built. And so going permissionless, we knew there were going to be a bunch of kind of lower effort, bot-like, airdrop farmer, whatever kind of pejorative term you want to use. And I think that my initial inclination is like, okay, we need to stop all these people. But I think if I step back, it's actually there are a bunch of people who are, English isn't their first language. Farcaster is an English-dominated social network. They're excited. They've been asking for an invite for years. Like, the invite process was by no means that efficient, like kind of a little bit of like randomness in terms of like me letting people in. But they're now able to join for the first time, and they just paid money, right? So now the existing people on the network got a year worth of Farcaster for free. Next year, if you want to keep using it, you have to actually pay the protocol. But these people paid money. And so I actually think I've tried to reframe my mentality here is, yes, they very well could be at the end just looking for some type of airdrop or kind of they're not ever going to want to conform in a kind of like norm oriented way of like, hey, being thoughtful, and whether that's just laziness or they just aren't able to. But I actually want to start from a place of people want to improve, people want to fit in. Like that's, I think, a natural human tendency. And so like, let's just start with like some basic guidelines, right? Like if I don't teach people, hey, these are the norms, then they don't know any better. Versus if, I have a bunch of these casts out now that you can kind of point to, or, you have a friend who joins the network and they're kind of giving these lower effort replies. They might share. It's like, hey, like people don't do that here. Like there's no, just by replying good doesn't get you a chance to getting an airdrop. Like if anything, that's actually going to hurt your credibility on the network. And so creating those norms explicitly is an attempt to say like, believe in people rather than just treat everyone as a hostile actor. And look, if people don't follow those norms at some point, and the beauty of the network is Warpcast can have a point of view and say, hey, we think that these low effort replies are going to be hidden by default. You as a user have the ability to toggle that off. Like you can kind of play like unfiltered mode. And then, but most people are actually saying, hey, when someone replies good to a cast where I put a ton of effort in, I don't actually want to see that, because when you do a reply,
it's not great.
Yeah. And here's the thing. When you do a reply, if you have notifications turned on because you are actually expecting people to be thoughtful, in a world where people are thoughtful, you do actually want to get a notification, because it's like getting a thoughtful letter. Like you're like, wow, that's great. I put my ideas out in the world and someone's willing to spend, time responding back. But when you get a notification that says good, you kind of are like, why am I wasting my time on this network? And so I think that there's a balance there. And so we will solve that one way or another. But what I want to do is say, hey, like, just use a like. Like it's expressing the same thing, but no one has likes turned on as a notification. Like we don't even offer that because it would be too noisy. Yeah. And so that's a little bit of like what I think we're trying to do there is assume good intentions, and partially just because people might not understand or know. And if it doesn't work from there, then I think you can take a little bit more of a heavy-handed approach. However, what's great is if Warpcast gets too heavy-handed with this, like we just decide we're too opinionated in terms of what should be shown versus not, people can go use another client right away. Like there is no like, oh, I have to migrate it like Mastodon or something. It's like, nope, boom, you can go use Flink or a different other client that's going to have a completely different set of product decisions related to what you see and what you don't see, or give you even more control over what you want to see. And so I think that that's the beauty of a network is there's a natural check on, as much as we think that this is the right approach, if the market doesn't believe that we are doing a good job there, other people will come and offer better solutions. And I think this is not even theoretical at this point. Flink offers a web-based crypto native sign-up flow that is cheaper than Warpcast, right? The only way you can sign up for Warpcast right now is $12 on mobile using in-app payments. We think that that's better for the average person long-term. But there are a bunch of crypto natives who want to sign up and they're saying, I don't want to do that. I want to pay a cheaper price and I want to use my crypto and I want to use my existing crypto wallet. Boom. They're able to do Flink. Flink is the majority of signups on the network. So the market is already responding to our product decision there. And that only works because we've done the hard work to actually make the network permissionless.
It's amazing. That was amazing to see. That was such a surprise too, to see that Flink was the one sort of getting the most signups on those first couple of days of permissionless. Was like, wow, okay, this is actually sufficiently decentralized. Well done.
It's like you said earlier, show me the incentive, right?
Well, the only thing I would say is one of the reasons it took us a while is we wanted to actually say, hey, the network is permissionless and it actually to work, right? So it's like those details need to actually, they matter. And so I think that there are a lot of, and this is from 10 years in crypto, there are a lot of people in crypto that like to talk about roadmaps and things that will happen in the future. And then those things never come. And so it's just like, just have a clear goal. Say, hey, this is what we're working on. This is the priority. Everything else is lower priority. Don't try to say that you're working on everything. And just actually deliver on it. So the team, and I feel like very little on the protocol side of things. It was, the entire team pushed on this for a year and a half. So
I feel like Nouns is running sort of a parallel experiment with the protocol and the ability to fork, where you can take your tokens with some of your friends and go and create your own Nouns DAO if you want, but you can't take the culture with you. So like all those norms are things that we sort of build in an emergent manner over time.
Yeah, look, I think Nouns is extremely inspirational for many reasons, but two stand out in my mind is one, the getting rid of the Discord is saying, hey, like an actual society doesn't have like a single way of like there needs to be multimedia. How about that in terms of like the way that people engage? And in doing so, is actually espousing a decentralized approach to building something versus a centralized approach. And so that I think is really impactful. I don't think any other like on-chain group has taken that approach outside of maybe like Ethereum. If you actually look at Ethereum, it's pretty decentralized in the sense that if you just look at the practical way of like how do you actually get an upgrade done in Ethereum, it's like you have to go convince the people who maintain the nodes, and in the case of the Ethereum nodes, there's diversity in nodes. So now all of a sudden you have to build social consensus across a bunch of competing teams that then have to think about what's in their best interest, but also the best interest of the network. So like I think that has also been an inspiration for us in terms of like how we want to build Farcaster. But I think the other thing is I think that the fork shows that the team is willing to commit to the actual vision and willing to pay a huge price to that in terms of like, you have a bunch of people leave, like have to take this hard-earned ETH for the treasury and let it go. But in doing so, I think of it as almost like a forest fire where it's like you actually kind of, it's this pretty traumatic thing that happens, but from that you get a lot of new growth and new life. And so I think actually being willing to kind of have nothing be too enshrined or too ossified as a way of doing things, that shows a dynamic community. And the fact that it's kind of being done, it is being done in a decentralized way. I think very few people have been able to accomplish that, because usually what happens in a decentralized manner is decision-making slows way down. You kind of run into these intractable, like you just can't get things done. And in doing so, it kind of things just die a slow death. So you've kind of hit this like, oh, we're decentralized, but then it's like, yeah, you're decentralized and ineffective. And so to be both decentralized and maybe effective is not the right term in terms of that's like putting judgment, as much as decentralized and moving forward with decisions that have consequences, I think is actually quite admirable. And I think a lot of decentralized teams within the broader on-chain ecosystem would learn a lot from paying attention to what's happening with Nouns.
So I have a question for you. Why didn't you fork your Noun? Why did you decide to stay?
Spicy.
I'm there for the meme, man. Like I think like the memetic value of something is very hard to quantify. And I think one of the things with Nouns that maybe people are underrating is if you just look at the success of CryptoPunks, there is a lot of value in a meme when it's the first and something that's early that later people come back and say, this was ahead of its time and I want a piece of this. And so I actually think people underrate that the art will be valuable at some point, assuming that the meme continues to proliferate. So I actually think like contrast punks to Nouns, the fact that Nouns is willing to try all these weird experiments, that I think is great. There is no one doing that. I mean, punks, I love punks. I have one. They are owned by Yuga Labs, and nothing against Yuga Labs, but it's just a very different vibe than a group of internet pseudonymous characters who are building their own shared culture and things like that. And so the money, I wouldn't have bought in to begin with. That's not, there are a zillion other assets you could go kind of put money into. To me, it's about the asymmetric zero. It's either worth nothing or it's worth a lot. And the memetic value is the thing that will actually drive the real value in the long run.
That was the same for me. Like Nouns was always about
vibe. Yeah,
it was always about the experiment for me, right? And so it was like, if I'm here for the experiment, then a quick cash out doesn't really move the needle on the experiment. So,
well, here's the other embarrassing thing for me is I was in Bitcoin like $75, and I was in ETH, sub $1. and I sold those,
Oh, wow.
large chunks in both cases when I thought like, oh man, like this is such a great return for me. And ye of little faith does not, like, it's just like the smartest decision in both cases. And the only perk for me in crypto was Coinbase's equity was illiquid for 10 years, so there was no ability to sell. And so I think that the best way to model all of this
saved you from yourself.
I mean, it was the best part. It's thank you SEC for not making it easy to sell Coinbase equity until it was actually public. But I think that the best way to think about all of this is if you believe in something that you're early to, and you believe it has memetic value, you should try to take a 10-year approach on it, right? And like this would be the first year I would be selling my Bitcoin.
Makes sense.
Even the ups and downs, I think like buying in at 75 and selling at 30,000, that would have been a much better return than selling it at 300.
That would be just fine.
Like yeah. So my sense is, if I've learned anything, it's just like, it's not never sell. It's just have a long-term view on things. Like 10 years is essentially an eternity. But if you just, and by the way, this is how venture as an asset class, right? Like venture capital, this is how it works. You don't have the daily, should I sell or should I not? Like, you're not a hedge fund. Because there is no liquidity.
10-year window.
And the reason these things work is you get the outsized returns when you invest in an Airbnb or Coinbase or whatever, Google. It's the ability to kind of let the compounding happen. And in the case of a meme, just like a startup, which if you think about a startup, a lot of times it is itself a meme. And so letting memetic compounding happen, it's extremely difficult in a world where you have the ability to like take liquidity at any point. And so I think that is easier said than done. But I think where I'm at my point in my life is just like anything you can get into early that you believe has asymmetric upside from a memetic standpoint, and you have like, you think the vibes are right and the people actually trying to push it forward, decade long bet. And be fine if in year 3 it would have peaked, and if you had just sold in year 3, better to have a portfolio of decade-long bets, because the ones that actually hit in year 10 are going to be, that compounding will have been extraordinary. And so that's like my refined view, and I'm now trying to practice what I preach, in the sense that like I didn't do it well enough for Bitcoin and Ethereum, unintentionally did it well with Coinbase, and so any of the NFTs I own, it's just revisit in 10 years. So 2031, that's the first time I can look at it and say, do I want to take liquidity here?
If you had waited until now to sell your Bitcoin, who knows? You could be going around to all the crypto conferences wearing a purple suit and a tie. You'd be Dan would have been the new Patricio.
The new Patricio. Speaking of memetic value, I wanted to mention today, as we're recording this, it is Purple's, the DAO that was that launched 1 year ago today. It's the Purpleversary. So I just wanted to ask about what you've thought about Purple DAO just kind of popping up on its own in this very decentralized manner, and sort of what they've done within the ecosystem for this past year.
Yeah, so nothing but positive things to say about Purple. I know they've had their ups and downs like any new thing, right? But I think, one, it speaks to the vibe that we've created with Farcaster, which I think is what we're trying to accomplish, is that the protocol is not owned by anyone. It is a decentralized thing, and the brand is not owned by anyone. So it's so exciting that, Chris and a couple others got together and said, hey, we're not necessarily actively working on this day to day. We have day jobs, or we're not working at Merkle Manufacturing, Warpcaster. But we care about this thing enough that we want to create an organization that wants to proliferate the meme. And so I think that that's great. And as a result, we ended up with Farcon, which that's where we met. And that was an unconference. Merkle has never gone to a conference, any conference, hosted a conference. Yet we have all of this meme proliferation. And I think that that's important because it allows people to actually start to feel ownership over Farcaster in a way that even if they're not committing code to GitHub or, working on a company full time, it can also be theirs as well. And so I think Purple was the first to kind of break the glass there in terms of saying like, hey, like Farcaster is what you want it to be for you. And I'm deeply appreciative for it. And I think one thing I would say is the protocol itself over time should be more decentralized in decision making. And I think we're operating in a world right now where we borrowed this from the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, rough consensus of working code. Like, and to be fair, that's actually very much how Ethereum works. Like we were talking about before, is like you actually need to get the nodes to upgrade the code, and so that's a lot of what needs to happen. But I think with Farcaster as the protocol development, like the underlying technical infrastructure, there will always be new improvements, but on a relative basis is probably not going to be as fast, especially compared, this year versus 5 years from now. But the social development of the network is going to actually hopefully continue to grow. And then like, that's our goal. And as more and more people are involved, that becomes more and more of an important part of what governance of Farcaster is. And so I think Purple doing this essentially unofficially is a good prototyping of like what works, what doesn't. Like we're learning a lot. So I'm very appreciative. I'm not as active in the sense that like I just have a lot of stuff going on in terms of just like trying to grow the protocol. But it's not lost on me that this is a group of people that is spending their free time on something that I'm working on full time. And I think that is, it's really meaningful to me. So I really appreciate everyone who participates.
I think that means you've built a good meme.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it says something very special about Farcaster that people are willing, like I don't see people jumping up and going, you know what I want to do today? I want to see how I can help Twitter succeed in the world.
Yeah, where's Twitter DAO? I don't see Twitter DAO.
There's no anywhere. Twitter DAO. There's no Twitter DAO launching a Nouns builder. And I think that it just says a lot, and you hear it over and over again from people who are building something on Farcaster or doing, being a CLP, a conversation liquidity provider, where we're, spending time talking about it or talking on it. And I think that really speaks to something special within Farcaster that's very different from any other social media platform or social network. So kudos to you there for sure.
Yeah, and I want to give David T. Fung credit here. I didn't quite have the concept, crystallized in my head, but he gave me a book at a Farcaster meetup about the Grateful Dead, and I kind of like perused it a little bit. I haven't had a ton of time to read books, but he actually did the best job explaining it. Is that, and I had a little bit of an understanding of this, and so it kind of clicked though. Is the Grateful Dead one of their, kind of strategies, whether intentional or unintentional, was they let people, they were like CCC 0 before it existed. It's like anyone could take the Grateful Dead logo and make t-shirts, and there was no licensing or anything like that. And so what you did is you ended up getting a lot of meme proliferation in an era when the internet didn't exist. Mm-hmm. And so I think a decentralized brand, and obviously Nouns is the epitome of this, but I think a decentralized brand, if you can make it work, and I wouldn't say we're out of the woods, but I do think Farcaster, and you can say this across, whether it's Purple or, Oxen, resident artist, Farcats, you just have a bunch of people building kind of like Farcaster-y things from a kind of like memetic and brand value. That is infinitely more valuable, in my view, than having super slick centralized marketing. And I think, especially from a protocol standpoint, if you're trying to build a protocol, you want it bottoms up, you want it grassroots. And I think what you end up having is a lot of protocols, they don't really spend a lot of time thinking about like what is the vibe we want to create here. By the way, Ethereum also really good at a lot of grassroots marketing, right? The fact that ETH Global and like you have all these, ETH Denver, and like you have all these kind of like conferences that people are just able to put the word Ethereum on it and kind of do it themselves, versus some other crypto projects tend to be, they use their massive war chest to kind of do a bunch of events, and those events can be high quality, but it's top down versus bottoms up. And obviously, Bitcoin is another good example of a decentralized brand. No one owns Bitcoin. The best thing that ever happened to Bitcoin is Satoshi going away. Like in terms of like it allowed you to have a decentralized brand instead of, and that's caused its own set of problems. And so I think the thing is that, so if you look at like Bitcoin and ETH, or Ethereum, like those are decentralized brands, Nouns decentralized brands, and so that's aspirationally, I think, what we want to be for Farcaster.
I hadn't thought about the Grateful Dead analogy, so cue the dancing bears, Toady. But it makes perfect sense. It really does, because that's such a grassroots effort from everything, from all the events that people would have just with Deadheads and things like that, that had nothing to do with the Grateful Dead organizing it. I think that's a great analogy there, where you do have these meetups that happen with people meeting up at Farcaster, like just meeting up with people that they've met on Farcaster and going to dinner and having those conversations and you see it with Nouns as well. And that kind of just speaks to the specialness of the network itself. So I think that's really interesting that we can see some of these things that have happened in history and like find those analogies are really, really kind of cool.
We put out a tweet and a cast asking our network what we should ask you, Dan. And we got quite a few responses to the cast and no responses to the tweet. So, I mean, take from that what you will. But here are some of the things that came up from the Farcaster cast. Noun40, who's been pretty instrumental in sort of leading by example and getting a lot of Nouners over and active on Farcaster. He asks, could Farcaster have potentially community-built algos? Could they have community-built Sybil detection? And could there be sort of community moderation? For example, some threshold of mutes in a channel results in a ban. Are these the types of things that could potentially be implemented in channels?
Yes, definitely. Let me address all three. So one, algos. My point of view here is better start with multiple clients, just because I think it sounds good in theory, and I know Blue Sky actually has implemented a version of this, but there's a lot that goes into like constructing an algo, and we're in 2023, so like having an algo that's a little static is not going to get like a lot of usage versus having something that whenever you refresh, and we're not even good at this yet with Warpcast, and we're going to hopefully be better. As much as people complain about the For You page on Twitter, the fact that every time you swipe down, you get 35 new tweets, like like I bet you people don't even realize that they're doing that a lot. And so I think algo generation is a very sophisticated thing that we haven't even gotten right first in Warpcast before worrying about how do you do other algos. And so I think there are two answers there. One, channels provide, kind of like a more curated experience about a topic. So you can kind of think of those as mini algos. And then I think other clients, right? And so in, kind of the simplest is if you just go to flink.fyi, like that's an algo. Like that's a homepage that is different than the Farcaster trending page. We don't use the same algo. So I think that is the first one.
So they developed that algorithm separately then, Flink?
Totally. Like there is no official algorithm to the protocol. Like you actually get it in your database, and then you have to make the decisions on how to do the algo. And even the simple as like reverse cron following, which is the simplest version of an algo. Do you do reply bumping? What happens if you recast? Like there are a zillion little product decisions that anyone building a client has to go do. And in each tweak actually is going to result in a different algo. I think in terms of channels, where we are with channels, we are trying to figure out the kind of like the set of features that actually make channels click. And so I'm spending nearly all my time on this. And once we figured that out, and we're doing that in a centralized way on Warpcast. So channels underlying at the protocol are actually permissionless. But the caveat is Warpcast has a lot of, the majority of users of Farcaster are using it. We only show channels that we've created. We don't want to have to deal with permissionless channels right now. It's just like too much work. There's a ton of moderation that would come as a result of that. Confusion, discovery. Like there's a bunch of features that you need to go build to make permissionless channels work well. And so our point of view is you can go create a channel at the client, the protocol level, and like Flink could go support that if they wanted. But Warpcast, we're just going to have this list and we're going to add to it. And in doing so,
I think somebody did all that. I saw a cast where someone said their client had separate channels, but they wouldn't show up as channels in Warpcaster. They would just show up as home casts.
But I actually just added this. I think I saw this yesterday. But our point of view is if we don't have to go add all those other features in order to make permissionless channels work, then I can spend time on what is the actual essence of like getting a channel to work. How do you deal with like, a low effort reply that is not, or off topic reply in a channel like Nouns. And so I think if we can iterate in a centralized way on Warpcast with our own set of channels over the next couple of months, then we're going to have a much better point of view on the thing that we should actually build that is part of the protocol that is decentralized. And I think one thing to consider is when you decentralize something, the rate of innovation and change goes way slower, and you have to build a lot more consensus in order to make that change. And so where we want to be is like, if this idea doesn't work, like throw it out. Like we can just keep moving at the Warpcast client level. And then what we'll do is we'll propose it. We have like EIPs, there's FIPs, Farcaster Improvement Proposal. We've had like 10 of them so far. But the idea is then you can propose it to the group of developers. They can weigh in and say, hey, I would want these other features. And then that's when you add it as kind of like canon to the protocol. And so that's how we're thinking about channels. And the moderation component of that is going to start centralized on Warpcast. And then we're going to have a proposal that works in a decentralized way.
Okay, so maybe at some point the community in a channel like Nouns could have some granular control on moderation, but just not quite yet. Is that a good
not
summary?
Maybe. Definitely, it will be something that people can control first on Warpcast, and then definitely anything that we do, if we think this primitive is actually worth doubling down on, then it will be decentralized into the protocol.
Okay, Dustmartn asked if you could wish for one superpower, what would it be?
Flight.
Definitely.
Right? Then you don't have to just dream about it, right?
I want.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I would want to make sure I have
Australia
like good
now.
oxygen. I would want good oxygen at a high altitude, but yes, flight would be nice.
And he says more seriously than that, why will people still be using Farcaster in 10 years? Bring in the spice.
There we go.
We figure out how to grow daily active users in a sustainable way and maintain a level of quality. So you get to millions of people using it every day. That becomes a pretty hard network effect to unwind, especially in a world where the underlying protocol is entirely permissionless. And so anytime someone's frustrated, if they have the ability to build a client, they will build a new app that offers solution to whatever they're frustrated about. And so I think it's just imperative for us to go from the several thousand people who are using Farcaster every day to several million. And I think at that point, then you're going to have a lot more staying power. If we don't scale daily active users over the next year, all of the work that we've done won't matter. Like it'll just be this little kind of science experiment. So it's really, really important for us to figure out how to grow.
Yeah, that was actually one of the other questions that came up that I was curious to ask, which was what, if anything, could cause Farcaster to fail as an experiment, which is a bit of a negative framing, but I am curious if you've thought about that and what your opinion is on that question.
Yeah, so it's default dead right now, right? So I think Warpcast is not profitable. Like we have a ton of money that we've raised, so we have a long runway. I think the team may start to lose interest before we run out of money because we've been careful about hiring. But I mean, I'm not losing interest anytime soon. So I think where we are is the thing that's exciting for people. It's exciting for other developers. It's exciting for people in the network is having the network grow. And so if we don't spend enough of our energy treating this as like an existential risk to the protocol, it'll just kind of die a slow death. Like nothing will be like existential tomorrow and like, oh, the network is done. I mean, I'm pretty confident in the technology from a protocol standpoint that we've built. But in terms of growth, like we have yet to figure out the way to sustainably grow the network. And I think I sometimes come across on Farcaster when I'm kind of saying, hey, lower priority for this feature or that. I'm like, and at heart, I'm like a perfectionist. Like there's a zillion things that I would love to just like polish up in the client and a bunch of like nice little tweaks and quality of life improvements, but none of that will actually move the growth of the network. And so I hope what people hear from me when I say that like this is the focus is that it's coming from a place of like we want Farcaster to succeed and actually to be able to stick around. And so doing the thing that is the hardest and the most existential for the network is where we're focused, rather than on things that might make people happy on the network today, but actually don't move the needle. We actually don't know how to, like, we're figuring it out. So it's not like we have like a perfect plan and like we just we're going to run this playbook and it's going to work. We're going through the idea maze and we're trying our best in terms of ideas, paying attention to what people are actually doing on the network, where are the pockets of kind of like quality and people kind of going above and beyond and saying, how can we take what's happening in Nouns or Farcaster or whatever channel, and how do we scale that? How do we bring more people onto the protocol and give them the tools and kind of make it very simple to understand of like, this is what you get out of using something like Farcaster.
So for somebody who's new and wants to join Farcaster, how do they go about that? What's their best option and why should they? Like, what's the value proposition of somebody joining Farcaster over another social platform?
So Farcaster.xyz, there's create an account right on the homepage. Maybe even we should make it like a green button like Facebook, so it's like very clear to click that button. Warpcast is easy to do on mobile, which is, I think most people on the network and most people on social media use mobile as their primary way of doing it, but you can sign up on web with Flink. Mobile Warpcast, you can use your in-app payment. You don't even need any crypto. And with Flink, if you're crypto native and you want to use your existing, MetaMask or something like that, you can do that. Why sign up? That is a little bit of a harder question. Like, it depends on the person, but the simplest way I would ask someone if they were like, why should I sign up for Farcaster? What are you interested in? And try to pull out from there. It's like, oh, well, I'm interested in gardening. Great. Well, we have a gardening channel and there's a bunch of people on the internet who are kind and thoughtful. And if you were to ask questions or talk about gardening, they're probably going to respond to you, even though they don't know you. So for some people, that sounds like, well, why would I want to talk to strangers on the internet? And then other people who may say, hey, wait, like that sounds awesome. Like, I wish I knew more people in my life who are interested in gardening. I'm this like weird odd duck wherever I live that, I want to find more people like me. And so I think we've done a decent job of actually in a community like EVM, which is like Ethereum virtual machine. It's like very technical. 5,000 people are following that channel. But there's a small group of people who are really dedicated to interacting in that channel. So it's like people talking about Solidity code and other things that are pretty technical and nerdy. And that's great. And so it's like, if that can be a home for people who like spend most of their day writing Solidity, and this is like a community of people that you didn't know before, but are thoughtful and engaging, great. And so I think if we can do that 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 different subreddit type, with channels, then I think we might have some legs. And just for like a data point, 130,000 active subreddits, 2.8 million created all time. So that's a 5% survival rate for subreddits. So you have to actually assume that there are going to be a lot. And you can imagine Discords are probably like this. It's like you get really excited, you start a Discord, and then no one actually joins it, or you use it for a week, and then everyone falls off. That's fine. That's completely fine. That's fine to have a small percentage of them work. And so I think where we need to figure out is like, one, what is the kind of like modality for creating one of these? Like, what are the tools that you give? Like, because everyone who creates something like a channel is an entrepreneur. They're a social entrepreneur in the sense that they are trying to build a group of people around some type of interest. And so giving them the tools to be able to do that in a way that allows them to grow and sustain that community, that's, I think, an imperative for us to figure out. And in doing so, then I think that the value prop gets really easy. It's like you either can find people who have similar interests to you, or you can bring people who have similar interests to you to this network, right? Or start a group and you'll actually find those people who might have some weird niche esoteric interest. And so that's actually, I think, what we're honing in on as the primary value prop.
Well, here's to interacting with kind strangers on the internet. We're all about that. And appreciate your time chatting with us today, Dan. It's been super fun. This will go live the first week in November. So looking forward to that. And thanks again so much for joining us today. It was great.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Dan.
We'll see you on Farcaster.
Fantastic. Yep.
Likewise.